Ordinance Committee meeting of March 29th to order, and if we could start with a roll call.
Councilmember Gutierrez.
Present.
Councilmember Jordan.
Here.
Chair Sneddon.
Here. Thank you. Do we have any adjustments to the agenda or any announcements before?
We
And
do not.
Do we have any members of the public wishing to speak on items not on the agenda?
For those who would like to speak for items not on the agenda, now is your time to raise your hand within the app. And currently, we do not have anyone who has their hand raised.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Grisanti. With that, we'll invite the staff presentation.
Thank you, Chair Sneddon. Sorry, there it is. The purpose of the hearing today is to review proposed amendments to expand options that address pre-existing violations discovered during the discretionary review process and to forward a recommendation to the City Council for adoption. The catalyst for these ordinance amendments was a recommendation from the Novak Consulting Group, who was hired in 2020 to assess the city's existing land development process and provide improvement recommendations. Recommendation 19 specifically stated that violations discovered during plan review should be addressed separately from the permitting process. Now, I'd like to give you a brief description of the city's current requirements. First, an applicant submits an application for discretionary review, such as design review, staff hearing officer, or planning commission. Next, staff checks the application to verify that it is complete and that it includes all the required information necessary for project review and approval. If there are any known violations or violations are found during plan review, they must be corrected as part of that application. Here are some examples of typical violations that we find. Sheds in the setback or open yard, overhead fences, window changes, unapproved dumpsters, restriped parking lots, etc. In order to address the Novak recommendation, the process for correcting these violations is proposed to be changed to meet three main objectives. First, give the applicant the ability to choose from several options to correct the violations. Second, if the applicant chooses to defer the abatement, it should not delay the processing of an application that was unrelated to the violations. And third, provide the city with more tools to allow flexibility when determining the remedy for abatement. Staff presented the amendments to the Planning Commission in 2021. Both the Planning Commission and the Planning Commission Working Group deliberated on multiple options to develop the objectives and proposed amendments. The resulting ordinance blends the need to provide more flexibility for applicants, streamline the process, separate unrelated issues, and maintain the city's obligations as a regulatory agency. To this end, the Planning Commission unanimously forwarded a recommendation to Council to adopt the final proposed amendments. I'll briefly walk through the key amendments that address the objectives. Chapter 1.25, under Abatement of Unlawful Conditions, clarifies the decision-maker's authority to condition a project for abatement. Chapter 30.205, under Review of Applications, defines the options for applicants on abatement. And lastly, in Chapter 30.205, under Enforcement and Penalty, it allows the director to make determinations on violations where there is limited permit history, and it also states the policy of the city regarding enforcement is to educate and work in partnership with property owners and businesses. In conclusion, staff recommends that the Ordinance Committee discuss the proposed amendments and forward a recommendation to the City Council for adoption. This concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you. And that was a brief summary of what were many, many Planning Commission meetings and subcommittee meetings. So thank you for that. We'll start with questions from the committee. Councilmember Jordan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I certainly don't want to relive the past slog through the process, but you know, I'm a graduate, so I end up asking those kind of questions anyhow. So my main concern is what you just said, is generally to give the applicant options And when I look at this, when I look at, say, the third page of the ordinance, I guess I'd just like to hear you assure me that when we look at the lineouts, we've lost, and this is just because I think I was there when we started this discussion on the Planning Commission, we've lost the connection to health, safety, and general welfare. We've lost those words out of the intent and just made it when the city wants to, I guess is the way I read that. And so how did that discussion go on losing it? My history with this is that if something was a imminent health, safety, and general welfare issue, there was no way in the world we were going to let that be removed from the discretionary process that was going on. But if there were items, as like on your example slide, that weren't an immediate health, safety, and general welfare item, we would find other options to fold that into either a separate process or a condition of approval at a future time, just like you explained it. But I'm kind of concerned about how the language lost that health, safety, and general welfare reference. So maybe if you could assure me, give me some assurance as to that. Does that make sense?
I'm going to try to answer this, and I might defer to the city, to ministers if Mr. Henschke or Mr. Colon can answer this. The objective to all of these amendments is related to zoning violations. It doesn't, this is not meant to undermine any health and safety decisions that are made by the building official. This is really Title 30 that we're talking about.
Okay.
If there's any health and safety issues, those will be abated. What the code really does in these amendments, it identifies the options that people have. And if it's an immediate health and safety issue, that might actually be done separately from the permitting process anyway, from the discretionary application, because if it's imminent, we would be needing to address that immediately. They wouldn't be waiting for the length of that discretionary process.
So is it really cleanup on the way that phrase was in the ordinance prior to this? It really separates it back out because it's more of a cleanup item to move?
I would say so. A lot of these were
Okay.
little nuances in the wording.
Okay.
They're really, if you look, there's a lot of amendments, and a lot of it is just cleanup wording as part of it. I feel like most of it is sort of the practice that we had that wasn't actually written anywhere.
Right,
So, but anytime there's a health and safety issue, that will always take priority.
right, okay. And then, so just kind of following that train of thought, when you go back a couple more pages, the top of page 5, which is in with 32050 C1A. So as you described this, it's to give the applicant options for now what we're not calling health, safety, and general welfare immediate issues. And that paragraph, and so I heard give applicant options. And that paragraph starts off, before it lists the actual options, it says, if both the applicant and the city agree. But then it obviously lists the option, the 3 little i's down there, is that one of the options would be the applicant could make that a condition of approval, which of something that is not related to their project, but could also have a time phase. And I guess I'm just channeling my inner applicant here in this process, and I think the intent is that unless we can't, we will always offer an option. And I just want to confirm that my recollection of our intent of always having that third option would be available unless there's some real clear reason that it couldn't be. So that I, as the applicant, would have the choice that, yep, put it in with my project, or nope, make it a separate issue, or it's an elevator that's still got the panel up high and it needs to come down low, but I'm just barely doing enough money on my project to break the threshold, and can I have 5 years to pay for that incrementally and make that a phase thing? So is that kind of the intent of all 3 of those choices?
Yes. The first thing is if it's not related to it, and unless it's a health and safety issue, it's something that, depending on how it is, it could be unrelated and simple, but complicated to address, right? Like a shed in the setback is always maybe easy to move, but you've got stuff in there. What are you going to do with that? Maybe
Right.
you can't move it, right? So in some cases, if it's completely unrelated to what they're doing, that could be dealt either separately, or we would create an enforcement kit to keep track of it and give them some more time to address that. If it's something where maybe it's unrelated, but as the decision maker, you have members of the public that are here commenting on it, and you want to put that as a condition of approval, that's another option that we wanted to make sure that the decision maker always had the ability to condition a project if they felt they needed to,
Right.
right? And then also, if it's related to the project, obviously it would be part of the abatement process. It would be part of the project that gets folded in.
Right.
So it always, we've gone through these applications, different scenarios, right? And I think the hardest thing that we dealt with, and this is why it had a number of meetings at the Planning Commission, is we were trying to, I think initially we thought it was a simple solution, but it isn't, because there's all kinds of
I
things
agree.
that come into these
Totally agree.
situations.
You can't define
Yes.
this on a piece of paper
So
in
the
a
best thing
book.
we could do that we felt that we were already doing, but it actually really wasn't codified in the ordinances, was actually outline what those options are and make it really clear that we're trying to work with people. We're really trying to educate people.
Okay.
If you look at our enforcement, we're not trying to, citations is not a money-making business. We use it to try to encourage people to abate the violations. That's all we want.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear as an answer, that we're trying to work with people, because even the examples you give are to me, I'll stray here a little bit, but to me, they're neighbor-to-neighbor examples, and if it's been that way for 20 years and a neighbor hasn't complained about a shed put on the setback on the back wall, then that shouldn't hold up a project, but that we want that stuff cleaned up, so maybe you give them 6 months or a year to clean it up. So I appreciate just exactly how you answered that, so thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair Sneddon, may I add something and then invite Mr. Henschke as well? I think the import of this section is that if everybody agrees on the violation, you can make it a condition of approval. If the applicant doesn't agree, it becomes an enforcement case.
Councilmember Gutierrez, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I just have a question. So is the purpose of this to protect the city from a case of being liable of seeing something that was in violation that later results in property damage or injury? Or is it just an overall sense of just complying with code?
So the the way the code is written today, we require that all the violations, whatever we find, has to be addressed as part of an application, or maybe even beforehand, depending on what it is. And the whole purpose is to allow some flexibility in it when it's not a life and safety issue. So it's not, I can't speak to the liability, I would defer to our city attorneys, but it's not going, I'm trying to think, you're smiling at me. I don't know if it's a liability issue, but it's just trying to kind of clarify things for people that go through our process so that it's clear on what the expectations are. Does that help?
Yeah, some of the criticisms I hear from residents is that, whatever the violation is, they claim that, this isn't hurting anybody, right? They'll say that. But maybe from their perspective, it's not, but maybe from an expert's perspective, city employee, they do see the potential hazard and danger that could develop from it, whether it's, the fence is too high, doesn't seem like it's a big deal, but little do they know that it obstructs people's ability to see something when they're driving or what have you, it just makes me wonder that if a city employee noticed it and said nothing about it, and then there's a subsequent injury because of it, could the city then be liable for it? And that's the reason why these kind of rules are in place is to make sure that basically the city isn't held liable for what these property owners do.
In terms of liability, I would defer to our city attorney. I would say that our rules, part of our health and safety, and part of quality of life. And we have a certain set of rules, and when we see something and it's identified, and we know it's a violation of the code, we kind of can't close our eyes to it. So in terms of having a level playing field for everyone, if one person built something without permits, and it could be innocuous, right? And the next person came in and asked and didn't do the same thing because they followed the rules, is that a level playing field across the board for everyone, right? If we don't think the rule is worthy of being a rule, then we need to change the rules. And I think one of the things that we did, and Councilmember Jordan Wood sat through all of these, and some of you might have too, was the adoption of Title 30, where we tried to fix some of those things. And there's still more work to be done. I mean, as we all know, our society has changed a lot, and we're all evolving, and the state has a lot of mandates, and so we're looking at how to streamline things and look at those maybe archaic rules that need to be reevaluated as part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I also have some follow-up questions. I'll start first with section 3205060. 160, excuse me, 3205160. It's on page 8 of the draft. And that paragraph there, did Planning Commission specifically see this paragraph, or was this out of the working group and didn't go back to Planning Commission yet?
So all the amendments before you were reviewed by the Planning Commission.
Okay, thank you. And if you could, on this one, just really explain to me how it works. So an example of when this would come into play, and step me through the process of that.
Are we looking at
Page 8.
page 1B?
I'm sorry, 1B, yes.
1B.
The new portion there.
So there are occasions where we don't have, when we see something out there that maybe isn't a setback. We don't have any permits that show one way or the other whether it was permitted or not permitted. And we didn't really have anything in the code that really outlined that the community development director had the authority to make that final decision on one way or the other. And I think that's what this really illustrates. It just provides that authority to the community development director because we didn't feel it was written in the code.
Thank you. So say you see a shed in the setback, and then the process then would be community development director would himself look at that shed and determine that it's not a health and safety violation, or I can determine that this one is good from here forward, or how does that actually in practice work?
So so we as staff are the designatees of the community development director. We look at anything that's available, any resources that are available in lieu of a permit. I can tell you we've looked at people's photographs, their family photographs. Last week I saw someone's photographs of construction where we could clearly see when it was being built. Old aerials, if you've ever looked at UCSB, they have a huge aerial library, and we've used that a lot to try to even figure out when a structure showed up on a property, and then try to make that determination, what were the rules in place at that point. So that's how we would apply it on the day-to-day when we have no permit history on something. We also had a period of time where the records were at the county, and not all the records made it back, and we've had people provide us with some of that information as well. So it's really for those gray areas where we're trying to just do the best that we can with the information that we want to make sure that there's some basis for the determinations that we're making.
Thank you, and I appreciate that flexibility. I think that's really important, and we see cases like that all the time where it's clearly has been documented, but then didn't make it into a final record. So then what would be the outcome of that portion? Is something goes in the file, something gets stamped, approved from here on out, or what happens after that?
So depends on the situation. I've seen us write a memo to the file Or if it's going through the plan check process, we would write notes in our planning. I just had one where they'll be coming in for some work, and we told them when they come back to show all the work that was done, because it's not documented anywhere. And part of it is really to help owners and applicants in that providing that documentation, so later on, after we're all gone, everybody understands what we recognize as permitted. So it's really making that record really clear. It really helps everybody in the long run.
Thank you. And then if there's a staff changeover in that time, other than notes in the file, because this has happened, so I'm just wondering about this, they'll go back and they'll go, well, the notes are in the file, but that doesn't mean it was okay. Or is there some sort of deemed approved, or we're not going to bother you about this again, or anything in the file that goes with that? So at the discretion, other than notes that it's documented.
Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of hard because we have to look at different situations. We document it in our plan check, so that could be one way. I say notes, but it's really documented in the record in some form or fashion. It just depends on how complicated or severe the item is that's outstanding, right, that needs to be documented. We've had projects where we know it's permitted, there's just no plans, right? So we would have somebody come in and submit a set of plans. And sometimes they'll write notes in there. We'll have, I say notes, I don't know how else to explain it, text to clarify that this is being submitted for the purposes of documenting the recorded history, what's acknowledged. And as part of our stamping off those plans, we're acknowledging that that is what we're recognizing as permitted. So it varies on the situation. So sometimes it will be a formal letter to the file. If it's maybe there's no permit there's no one applying for a permit at that point. Someone's just trying to clear the record. And we do have people sometimes that come ahead of submitting an application because they want to make sure they know what's going to be in front of them, right, what they'll have to address, and they want to clear that up ahead of time. We actually have one right now where they're trying to figure it out, and it's not quite what they thought it was either. It's a little bit in the middle. And then if it's already part of the process, we will include it as part of that process. I've been here for a while, and I can tell you that I've looked everywhere. I've looked at old photos, I've looked at old minutes, files, little notes that people write on plans just to try to figure out what happened. And sometimes we're really fortunate we have all the information before us, but other times someone just has to make a decision, whatever that is. And we base it on all the information that we can get. And we are always open to anything else somebody wants to bring, so that we just want to have the full picture, whatever that is.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry to get hung up on this particular paragraph, but so it's in the file. I'll give an example. Say someone buys a house and it has a basement already, and they want to do a change to a stairwell somewhere in the house. And the basement was never in the initial plans. There's no record or permit, but you can find through the records that it was done well, and you have documentation of the building of that basement. Other than the documentation, so they can put their stairwell in, does that basement now no longer become an issue if now they want to put a window in or something else? Or is it always sort of just it's documented, and that particular application it didn't affect, but it might affect a future application? This doesn't make it, legally non-conforming exactly, or?
I would say if we are approving a staircase down to a basement, we would be addressing it at that point. So if we,
Stairwell somewhere else in the house,
oh,
scope creep, like, oh, you have that unpermitted basement.
it might be a health and safety issue, I don't know. It's kind of hard. I think it would depend on what information is available. If there's plans that show that it was a dirt understory and there was no basement, that's one thing. I think it just depends on the situation, because I've seen both, where you can tell it was a basement, you look at the footings, you look at how it was built, the building inspector will go out there and look at it. And I've seen others where it was clear that it was dirt, and then it got changed afterwards. And you can kind of see by the construction that it was a little bit different.
Thank you. I think I'm being maybe too specific. So say that the building inspector, and it's not a health and safety issue, they look at it and they're like, this basement is not a problem, it's going to be fine from here on out. Does it need to be looked at again every time a new application comes through, new project application? Or is it, and I'm not suggesting it should be or shouldn't be, I'm just not sure I understand, other than notes in a file, which I know are considerable. I don't mean to diminish those, but a lot of times people are like, well, it's in my file. But that doesn't mean it's okay.
Well, it depends on the scope of the work. If you're coming in for, let's say, in kitchen remodeling, you're showing the entire house, you're showing all kinds of other things, but the scope of your work is an interior remodel of your kitchen. For the most part, that's all we're really looking at. So we're not looking at the rest. So maybe it isn't addressed at that point because we were never looking at that, right? It depends on what's being looked at that point. Showing it on a plan doesn't necessarily legalize something if that was never part of the scope of work. I mean, that's part of also trying to focus the review on what's before you. And the scope creep that you're referring to as well.
Honorable Chair,
Yes, please.
thank you, and I apologize for not being there in person. I actually happen to have a cold, and I think that there are rules I'm not allowed into the chamber, so I apologize for being on the line. I think we're getting a little bit confused here about what this section actually does and what we're talking about in terms of enforcement. This section was intended to establish a criteria for determining if a structure that we couldn't find the historic record of, how would you determine what the rules were that applied when it was built? And that's really all this section does. And it says that you'll make the determination based upon the codes and laws that were in existence at the time it was built to determine if it was lawfully built or is subject to some other kind of immediate code action. This section has nothing to do, and this whole entire ordinance does not deal with building code and Title 22, which are the health and safety violations that often exist. This is all about zoning code violations and what do you do in terms of enforcement of the zoning code. So what this section does is it helps to establish the baseline enforcement standard for a violation that we don't have another kind of permit or something showing that it was authorized at the time it was built. Once you establish that baseline, then you would take enforcement action. If it is inconsistent with the codes at the time it was built, then you could take immediate enforcement action. If it was consistent, then you would use that new baseline as the basis for determining whether it would need to be brought into compliance because of some other action. And we would go back to the other sections that talk about how do you implement those kinds of corrections. But nothing in here has to do with health and safety violations. For example, the stairway into a basement is probably a building code violation, and that would be dealt with completely outside of this particular section. And I hope that helps clarify what this section does. This is about enforcement of zoning in Title 30 standards. That's all it does.
Thank you, Mr. Henschke. Can you give me an example of what a zoning violation would be that this would apply to?
Sure, and I'm going to defer back to Maricela to make sure that I get a fact right. But let's suppose that there was a building. Let's use a shed that is in a side yard, and we can't find any record of a permit having been issued for that shed. So we need to determine was the shed lawfully constructed at the time it was built in accordance with the zoning ordinances? You would use whatever evidence you have to determine when the shed was built. And then you could do a historical research to determine at the time it was built. Let's say it was built in 1952. It's 70 years old. And we could go back and we could determine if there was a setback requirement in 1952. And if there was, and the shed was there, it's probably been a violation for 70 years, and we can then move to the enforcement standard. If there was a no setback requirement, then we would determine that it was a legally existing non-conforming use, documented in the record, legally existing non-conforming structure, documented in the record, and then move on to whatever next came.
Thank you, and that's exactly my question on this one. So in the record, there will be some notation, either that it's legally existing, non-conforming, or not. I mean, there's some determination that's made, and that stays in the record. Thank you. That's exactly the point that I was trying to understand, is at the end of that process, what's in the file, if it's just notes or if there's a determination. And I apologize if I'm the only one that this is not clear to, this section, but I'm not sure that establishing of a baseline comes across in this paragraph, or I didn't get it out of reading that paragraph, so I don't know about that portion. Maybe a little bit of clarification there. And then I apologize too, just detailed questions on, I'm hoping that you can just step me through the 3205050, 1A, B, and C. Each one just really specifically what it means. So, and in detail, if you could, just, I think this is where all of the debate at Planning Commission came forward. There was those 5 options, and then there was option 3, and then the change on option 3, and consideration of option 5. And what I'm hoping to get at here is the end result after all of that. If you could tell me what voluntary compliance means. And Mr. Klon, I think you touched on it, that if everybody agrees, I'm not sure what that means. What does it look like for everybody to agree? Is that a legal process? Is that just the particulars of the logistics of how these determinations are made? I think I have questions on. So if you could just step me through A, independent of B, independent of C, it would be very helpful for me.
I'd like to defer to Mr. Henschke. I want to give one 30,000-foot comment. Mr. Henschke worked this through with the Planning Commission subcommittee. Our overwhelming concern with Novak 19 was to avoid a permanent waiver of our ability to enforce. So with that guidance, Mr. Henschke went to work. Dan?
Thank you, Honorable Chair, members of the committee. Okay, so walking through let's just go through the section. If the applicant and the city agree on the nature and extent of the violation and the proposed correction, okay, well, we know what kind of that means. There's a collaborative process. We identify what the violation is. The applicant either can agree or disagree with it. But then if there is an agreement on the extent of the violation and what it is, the applicant has 3 ways of dealing with it. One is the applicant can include the correction of the violation as part of the proposed project application. And that's really where we kind of started with, because the existing code requires that it be included in the current application. But rather than making it a requirement in all cases, it becomes an option for the applicant in this case. The next step would be inclusion on a separate concurrent application. One of the big complaints that we heard during the deliberative process at the Planning Commission and in the subcommittee was projects were getting delayed because of trying to correct sometimes unrelated violations, sometimes related violations in the context of a project application. And that was slowing down the process to a point that many consider to be intolerable. And so this would allow the applicant to process a separate application to deal with a different violation or a different set of circumstances and run those through concurrently, kind of like what Council Jordan was getting at in terms of the timing of the application. So that's A2. And then A3 is you don't include it in the current application, which might require resubmittal of plans and review of redesigns and those kinds of things, but it could be included as a condition of project approval, such that it could be implemented as a phased project as part of the current application as a condition of approval. Specifics as to how that would work on any particular project obviously are very fact specific, and I would have to defer to Maricela on that. So those are the options for correction of an agreed violation. If the applicant disputes the violation or the proposed correction, for example, if we say you need to do this and the applicant says, no, I don't want to do it, I want to do that, then it can be referred to an enforcement action. The one thing what we wanted to make clear, and we did make clear in this ordinance, is that the ability of the city to enforce its code, which is an independent kind of prosecutorial discretion decision that's vested in the city prosecutor, that separate enforcement action is never constrained. And so we have the ability, for example, to take care of health and safety violations. And if the applicant does not agree to fix it, it is subject to substantial penalties up to and including misdemeanor prosecution.
Thank you. And then option C there,
Oh, I'm sorry.
if you would. Thank you.
Okay, I apologize about that. This actually goes to the question of that I was just speaking about. Currently, an application cannot be deemed complete if we don't resolve the violation. What this section says is that an application can be deemed complete, but that any approval or of that application or other action on it does not constitute authorization for the continuation of the violation, or in any way prevent the city from using its enforcement discretion to take enforcement action at a future time or immediately. This is basically it's the city's reservation of complete rights to enforce its code when it needs to.
Thank you. And I actually think that's maybe the most important one is C there. And I just want to ask you in particular, Mr. Henschke, you voiced some concern about us having policies that we couldn't enforce and what that would mean to us as a city. Does this option C, to your satisfaction, address that?
It does, and this office and I have approved all of the language that's in the proposed ordinance. So we're comfortable with everything that's in it.
Okay, thank you. Because I realized during that, since there were so many meetings and sort of coming to the middle and compromises, I just wanted to take it back to the beginning when staff proposed that they were comfortable with option 1, could live with options 2 through 4, and were opposed to option 5. And I just want to make sure that in this final language that those concerns to your comfort, have been addressed?
They have.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have any public comment?
Currently, there is, we don't have anybody online raising their hands, but those who are listening, if you would like to make comments on this item, please raise your hand within the app. Nobody.
No public comment. Okay, then it's to the committee and for comments. Councilmember Jordan.
I'll just start off by moving the recommendation. I'm happy with it, and then just make some other comments. If somebody wants to second it. But, you know, I kind of chafe over our relationship sometimes of, you know, words on a page, on a book, on a wall kind of thing, because really what's out there is real life, real people, real situations, and you can never really capture all that entails on words, on a page, on a book, on a wall. And my experience after being here quite a while, and actually I could walk you around my property and we could put stickers on everything we're talking about, whether it's the chicken coop on the back wall or the fence that's been there since 1956 in the double yard setback and that type of thing. But, you know, I find that people generally are either much more accepting and accommodating than city ordinances, or people aren't, but they're very reluctant to speak up. They're very reluctant to get into that dynamic and complain about a tall fence or the chickens next to their yard or a boat being parked in a backyard in the setback, whatever that may be. And I think this has run a gauntlet and come out with a reasonable product that addresses both those situations. It allows us the flexibility as a city to make decisions on the ground where it doesn't look like that big a deal, and it also allows us to have the hammer, so to speak, when it does make that big a deal, or we do hear from the residents that are living in the neighborhood that they've been living with this and they shouldn't have to live with this. So it's been a long slog, I think, but I think it's gotten to where it's better than it was. It's probably needs to be iterative, because I think we all live differently than my parents lived or my grandparents lived in the same neighborhood. Just things change. I guess we put up with more or we put up with less, whichever it may be. And so I think I see this as an improvement and certainly a step in the right direction, and happy to support it.
Thank you, Councilmember Jordan. Any comments? Councilmember Gutierrez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to emphasize that I hope the public understands that these rules and regulations are in place to better the quality of life and the quality of our community, and to protect life and property. And yeah, I'll be supporting the motion. Thanks. Once it's made.
The motion still needs a second if you'd like to.
I'll second.
Thank you. And then I'll make my comments also. It definitely has been through a long process. With that Novak report and taking seriously those recommendations, this has to happen. I mean, that recommendation 19 and the ways that we're slowing down our own processes and binding ourselves from being able to, like you're saying, with the actual real situations, if they're not health and safety and things that we can handle case by case, then this allows for that flexibility. But I was very concerned when we were considering not allowing ourselves to enforce when we needed to enforce. So with that language in 1C there, I'm comfortable with this as it's moving forward, and I'm very happy that we've decided to move in this direction rather than to allow things to go unenforced ever. So I think with that, I think we're ready to take a vote on the motion.
Okay, we have a motion moved by Councilmember Jordan, second by Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez, to move staff recommendations of proposed ordinance amendments to City Council. Councilmember Jordan,
Yes.
Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez,
Aye.
Chair Snedden.
Yes.
Thank you.
And
Motion passes.
with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.